Here is a purple ink by Noodler's Polar Krill. Now this ink comes to me from Angry Rooster Creations here on YouTube. I'm going to link them down in the description. Please check out their channel and give them the credit they deserve. Now this is a light, very light purple, but never too light to read. The tone in the writing is the same that we get in the swatch, and the chromatography shows that this is a very permanent ink. This has a very consistent tone through various papers and just has the slightest bit of shading. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs generally like, it performs pretty good on the writing side for the most part. In a couple spots, if you look close, you can see tiny bits of feathering. That's on the writing side, but it does have that polar inky aggression, and it does get very deep into the page, which might make me avoid it depending on the paper that I'm using. Now, for me, this ink will be a hard pass on a bottle, but only because of the tone of purple. It isn't for me. I will say that some of its performance on a bunch of these papers had me intrigued, but not enough to say I want a bottle. Perhaps enough to go out and buy another sample. The pen for today is an Asvine V126, a vacuum filler. Now, we might just call it an Asvine, except it performs extremely well, so we're going to say Asvine, so that we don't make it mean, though I've already said it. Looking at the tone, we get to see that this is indeed a very light purple. Almost gives me a kind of light pink vibe about it as we see it here on the page, but definitely a purple with it. It does not feather, it does not spread, it barely gives any shading. The G in boxing looks the tiniest bit darker, but for the most part, I'm going to call this a single tone. Looking at the back of the page, we see I circled a bunch of spots, and it got very deep into the paper. Now, it did not bleed through touching the page on the other side, but this is Clairfontaine. This is a really good paper, and it is struggling with this ink, which does not give us some of the best prospects in the future for what might happen.
Noodler's makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Noodler's.
Here is Noodler's Pushkin. Here is Noodler's Lexington Gray. Here is Noodler's Golden Brown. Here is Noodler's Dark Matter.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we see the tone is the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. The wider lines are really just because of the nib itself. It doesn't really shade. I mean, we can go and say that Y of quickly looks ever so slightly darker, but barely shading at all, mostly giving just a really consistent result. This paper usually does very good for just that, not showing off the shading, but really good at showing the color well. Looking at the page underneath, we see two spots that it did bleed through, touching the page on the other side. That's a bleeder right there. Yeah, this could be a problem because this is not an especially wet pen. So this gives us a good indicator, along with what happened with the Clairfontaine, to say that this probably wasn't the best pen choice. Obviously, a lot of ghosting going on.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, generally speaking. Again, you could look super being picky at the VE of 5. That's being over picky, I think, for this, considering Polar inks generally are a little more aggressive, and this is non-fountain pen friendly paper. It's not spreading. It's got the tiniest moments of shading that do occur. You see it with the M and the bottom of the P in jumped, but it's not any kind of standout quality to it. I do think it's giving a very nice tone of a light purple, though just not the tone for me. To continue the bloodbath, this is the bleed spots from the page underneath. And when we look at the back of the page, we see that it got very deep into the paper. Obvious sign from the bleeding. There is no writing back here. There's a whole lot of ghosting. If you wrote on the back of the page, you're going to lose both sets of notes.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. Shades about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which was hardly at all. The most important thing is that we're looking at this to see how it stands out against the quad rule, and I think it's doing well enough. Not great. I do kind of see the lines with it. The lines don't disappear for me, but it works well enough. I can ignore the quad rule with it. It just at first takes a little bit of effort. Not bad in what's happening. Looking at the back of the page, if we remember how bad things were for the Clairfontaine, it did do better here on the Rhodia. Now, it still got very deep into the paper. A couple of spots it looked like it wanted to come through. It did not bleed through to the page underneath. I think you possibly could write on the back of the page here and not lose both sets of notes. I would just sort of test it before you took important notes with it.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Noodler's Purple Martin. Here is Noodler's Cactus Fruit Eel. Here is Noodler's North African Violet. Here is Noodler's Pasternak.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does have tiny bits of feathering, which is incredibly unusual on this paper. This paper usually handles inks without any kind of real problem and only causes the tone to get a little bit lighter. Yet here, it's doing that. It's getting the lighter and it's getting the tiny spots of feathering. Very disappointing, very alarming to see. Now, we have no real spread and we get no real shading. Not the problem here. Looking at the back of the page, this is where the problem is. That is a lot of ghosting for this paper. I can go through lots of pages of writing in here and not deal with this level of aggression from an ink. This is very aggressive, very problematic in that sort of way. That being said, if you're a student that only writes on one side of the paper, this might work perfectly fine for you. It's not always about finding a perfect ink. It's about finding the right use and paper combination for that ink.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's GI Green.
Here is Noodler's Sequoia. Here is Noodler's Polar Brown.
Here is Noodler's Bad Green Gator.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get the tiniest bits of feathering, and the fact that this is 20-pound copy paper and we're only getting the tiniest bits of feathering is in itself a good thing. It's nothing against this ink. It's doing incredibly well here. It does have the tiniest bit of spread, not really being a problem with the paper that this is on. We're not really getting any kind of shading, but when we got shading in any of the other spots spots it was only the tiniest little bit, and you kind of had to look for it. Looking at the back of the page, this handled it about as well as any of the other papers. Really, I mean, consider how it did on the Clairfontaine and on the Rhodia. The fact that this is all we're getting on the 20-pound copy paper really speaks incredibly well for how good this ink is on inexpensive paper. It never bled through to the page underneath, though you could not write on the back of the page here.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow medium nib of the Asvine V126 gives a generally consistent tone with almost no shading at all, but did show quite a bit of inky aggression, not just on the non-fountain pen friendly papers, but on most papers. To avoid the inky aggression on non-fountain pen friendly papers, even on those premium papers, I would suggest going with a dry medium or a dry fine. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.